For nearly 12 years, Ethan watched the lives of other people unfold without saying a word. He saw marriages begin and end. He saw friends become grandparents. He saw high school classmates celebrate retirement. He knew who had moved to Florida, who had lost a loved one, and who had finally bought the truck they had dreamed about for years. Yet if you visited Ethan's social media profile, you would think the account belonged to someone who had disappeared. No photos, no comments, no opinions, no signs of life. And Ethan wasn't alone. Millions of Americans were doing exactly the same thing. They were always present, always aware, but almost completely invisible. Most people assumed they had nothing to say. Others believed they were lonely or simply uncomfortable with technology. But psychologists who spent years studying human behavior discovered something that changed the way experts understood these silent observers. And what they found wasn't sadness, isolation, or fear. In many cases, they found something nobody expected. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What made Ethan's story so fascinating wasn't what he shared with the world. It was what he kept to himself. Every evening after dinner, he sat in his favorite chair, opened Facebook, and quietly checked on people he hadn't spoken to in years. His former co-worker, Michael, had become a grandfather. Sarah, a woman he once knew in high school, had posted pictures from Yellowstone National Park. Another friend had announced his retirement after 38 years of working construction. Ethan celebrated their happiness privately. Sometimes he smiled. Sometimes memories flooded back. Sometimes he whispered, "Good for him," before placing his phone on the table. Yet he never pressed the like button. He never typed a comment. He had written thousands of comments over the years, but almost every single one had been erased before anyone could read them. Friends often joked that Ethan must have forgotten his password, but they had no idea what was actually happening inside his mind. And as researchers began studying people like Ethan, 3 questions emerged that would challenge everything society believed about silence. Why were these people choosing invisibility in a world obsessed with attention? What were they afraid of? And why did brain researchers eventually conclude that many silent observers experience the digital world in a completely different way from everyone else? Long before social media existed, Ethan had learned something that stayed with him for decades. When he was 16 years old, he raised his hand in class and answered a question incorrectly. The room burst into laughter. It lasted only a few seconds, but those seconds remained with him for years. He remembered the embarrassment. He remembered wishing he could disappear. As he grew older, those memories faded into the background, but they never completely left. Years later, when Facebook arrived and millions of people began sharing every detail of their lives, Ethan approached the digital world differently. To him, posting a picture wasn't simply uploading a memory. It felt like standing in front of hundreds of people waiting to judge every word and every expression. Psychologists have a name for this. They call it social evaluation anxiety. Researchers found that many people who rarely post aren't avoiding others because they dislike them. They are performing calculations without even realizing it. What if somebody misunderstands me? What if I say the wrong thing? What if people laugh? What if they think I'm foolish? And without realizing it, their minds decide that silence feels safer than exposure. But as scientists continue their studies, they discovered something even more surprising. For some people, fear wasn't the answer at all. As researchers continued examining people like Ethan, they began to notice something that seemed almost impossible. Many of these silent observers weren't insecure. They weren't lonely. They weren't disconnected from the world around them. In fact, some of them had thriving families, successful careers, and close friendships. Yet they all shared one unusual trait. They believed everyone was paying attention to them. Ethan didn't realize it, but every time he thought about posting a photo, his mind imagined hundreds of eyes studying every detail. He imagined old coworkers judging his appearance. He imagined distant relatives questioning his opinions. He imagined strangers noticing things that nobody would ever actually notice. One evening, Michael called him after seeing pictures from a fishing trip they had taken months earlier. "You know, "Ethan, you should post some of those pictures," Michael said. "Those were good memories." Ethan smiled and promised he would think about it. After hanging up, he opened his phone and looked through dozens of photographs. There was one of the sunset reflecting off the lake. Another showed the two friends laughing beside the boat. There was even a picture of the largest bass Michael had caught all year. For a moment, Ethan considered sharing one. He typed a caption, read it twice, then deleted everything. He convinced himself that people would think the pictures were silly. He imagined someone criticizing his smile. He worried that others might find it boring. Within seconds, the idea disappeared, and the photos returned to the privacy of his camera roll. What Ethan never realized was that most people were far too busy thinking about themselves to spend even 10 seconds judging his post. But the mind has a remarkable ability to create audiences that don't really exist. Psychologists call this the spotlight effect. It causes ordinary people to believe that everyone is watching them when, in reality, everyone else is busy worrying about themselves. And the more Ethan stayed silent, the more powerful this belief became. But another discovery caught researchers by surprise. Many people like Ethan had something hidden on their phones that nobody else ever saw. Thousands of pictures, years of memories, family reunions, birthdays, vacations, fishing trips, holidays, pictures with grandchildren, memories that meant everything to them. Yet almost none of them ever appeared online. Ethan was no exception. One rainy Saturday afternoon, while organizing old albums, he realized his phone contained more than 6,000 photographs. Looking through them was like opening chapters of his life. There were pictures of his father before he passed away, photos from the day his daughter graduated college, images from camping trips, anniversaries, and quiet evenings spent laughing with people he loved. Michael had often joked that Ethan owned enough photographs to start a museum. Yet the strange thing was this. Nobody outside his closest family had seen most of them. Every few months, Ethan would tell himself he should share more memories. He would choose a picture carefully, adjust the brightness, rewrite the caption several times. Then doubt would begin whispering questions. Maybe the picture wasn't good enough. Maybe the caption sounded foolish. Maybe nobody would care. Maybe you should wait for a better photo. And just like that, another memory remained hidden. Researchers gave this pattern a name: maladaptive perfectionism. The pursuit of perfection becomes so powerful that action itself disappears. People would rather remain invisible than risk appearing imperfect. But scientists eventually discovered something that changed the entire conversation. Some silent observers weren't held back by fear. They weren't trapped by perfection. Their silence was something entirely different. And Ethan would slowly realize that he belonged to that group. By the time Ethan turned 60, something inside him had changed. He had spent decades watching the world chase attention. He had watched arguments destroy friendships. He had seen families divided by politics. He had witnessed people measure their happiness by likes and comments. And somewhere along the way, he reached a quiet conclusion. Peace was more valuable than approval. One evening, while sitting on the porch with Michael after a barbecue, the conversation drifted toward social media. Michael laughed and said, "You know, Ethan, half the people online are trying to convince strangers they're happy." Ethan smiled and nodded. Then he said something Michael would never forget. "Maybe happiness doesn't need witnesses." The sentence hung in the air. Neither man spoke for several seconds. They simply listened to the crickets and watched the sun disappear behind the trees. Years earlier, Ethan would have worried about being misunderstood. Now, he no longer cared. He enjoyed watching friends celebrate milestones. He genuinely felt happy for them. But he no longer felt any desire to prove his own happiness to the world. He had learned something that many people spend their entire lives trying to understand. Not every blessing needs applause. Not every memory requires an audience. Some moments become more meaningful when they belong only to the people who live them. Researchers studying personality traits found that introverted individuals often protect their energy differently. They don't dislike people. They simply experience peace through reflection instead of performance. Yet even this explanation failed to account for everyone, because brain researchers would eventually uncover something nobody saw coming. Using modern imaging techniques, scientists began studying how different brains responded to social rewards. What they found challenged assumptions that had existed for years. For some individuals, the reward centers associated with pleasure became more active while observing and learning than while seeking recognition. In simple terms, people like Ethan gained satisfaction from understanding the world rather than broadcasting themselves to it. They enjoyed listening more than speaking. They found fulfillment in watching loved ones succeed. They preferred meaningful conversations over public performances. They experienced joy privately. This explained why Ethan never felt deprived by his silence. He wasn't fighting against his nature. He wasn't suppressing some hidden desire for attention. His mind simply valued different rewards. While others found excitement in posting updates, Ethan found peace in quiet appreciation. And strangely enough, as researchers interviewed thousands of people, they discovered something remarkable. Many silent observers possessed high levels of empathy and emotional awareness. They noticed details others missed. They remembered birthdays without reminders. They listened carefully. They valued depth over popularity. And perhaps that explained why Michael always called Ethan whenever life became difficult. Through decades of friendship, Michael had learned something that statistics could never measure. The quietest person in the room often understood the most. By every measure, social media was designed to reward visibility. Every platform promised connection. Every notification delivered small bursts of excitement. Likes became approval. Comments became conversations. Followers became proof that somebody was paying attention. Millions of people spent years sharing family photos, celebrating milestones, debating current events, and documenting everyday moments. It became so normal that many people started believing participation itself was human nature. After all, if everyone wanted to be seen, why wouldn't everyone want to be heard? Yet hidden among the endless updates and smiling pictures was a group that fascinated researchers. They were always present. They knew what was happening. They remembered anniversaries. They knew who had retired, who had moved away, who had become grandparents, and who was going through difficult times. But they almost never revealed themselves. No comments, no opinions, no photos, nothing. And people like Ethan existed by the millions. Michael used to joke about it. Whenever they met for coffee, he would laugh and say, "Ethan, you know more about everybody's lives than they know about each other, yet nobody knows anything about yours." Ethan would smile and shrug. Even he couldn't fully explain it. He wasn't hiding in the traditional sense. He had friends. He had family. He enjoyed conversations. He wasn't afraid of technology. Yet something always stopped him from stepping into the spotlight. And he wasn't alone. Researchers found that countless men and women across America behaved exactly the same way. They consumed information every day. They followed stories. They celebrated people privately. But they remained almost completely invisible. It raised questions that experts couldn't ignore. What were these people keeping to themselves? Were they protecting something? Were they afraid of criticism? Had they simply lost interest and attention? Or was there something much deeper taking place inside their minds? For years, society made assumptions. Some believed these silent observers lacked confidence. Others assumed they were lonely or disconnected. Some dismissed them as people who didn't understand technology. But psychologists who spent decades studying personality and behavior discovered that those explanations barely scratched the surface. Because many of these quiet individuals lived full and meaningful lives. Some were successful businessmen. Others were retired veterans, teachers, grandparents, church leaders, men and women who had raised families and weathered decades of life's victories and disappointments. They weren't disconnected from the world. In many ways, they paid closer attention than everyone else. And that was what puzzled researchers the most. Why would someone willingly reject attention in a culture that celebrated visibility? Why would millions choose silence when the entire digital world seemed built around being noticed? And perhaps the most fascinating question of all was this: Why did psychologists eventually conclude that many silent observers weren't avoiding attention because something was wrong with them, but because their minds process the world differently? Most people think they know the answer. They assume these people are simply shy. They believe confidence is the missing ingredient. They imagine that one encouraging comment or one successful post would suddenly transform silent observers into active participants. But those assumptions overlook something that often begins long before Facebook, Instagram, or smartphones ever existed. Because for people like Ethan, the roots of silence didn't start online. They started years earlier, hidden inside memories that seemed small at the time. Memories that most people would eventually forget. A careless joke, an embarrassing moment, a painful rejection, a few seconds that left impressions lasting decades. And without realizing it, those moments quietly shaped the way Ethan saw the world. Long before social media arrived, his mind had already learned a lesson that would follow him into adulthood. A lesson that made staying silent feel safer than being seen. And the first reason behind that choice began with something psychologists call social evaluation anxiety, a pattern that starts much earlier than most people could ever imagine. One evening, after finishing dinner and settling into his recliner, Ethan picked up his phone and saw that an old friend had shared pictures from a fishing trip. Michael had already left a comment, along with dozens of other people. Ethan smiled when he saw the pictures. They reminded him of summers long gone, days spent laughing with friends, and quiet mornings beside the water before life became so busy. Without thinking, he began typing a thoughtful response. He thanked his friend for sharing the memories and even mentioned a trip they had taken nearly 20 years earlier. He read the message once. Then again, he changed a few words. He stared at the screen for another 10 seconds. Then he erased the entire thing. A few minutes later, he tried again. This time the comment was shorter, simpler. He read it twice and deleted it again. Finally, he locked his phone and leaned back in his chair. Nobody had stopped him. Nobody had criticized him. Nobody had even seen the comment. Yet somehow, posting those few words felt strangely uncomfortable. And this wasn't the first time. In fact, Ethan had repeated this ritual thousands of times over the years. Thoughts entered his mind. Words reached his fingertips. And then something invisible convinced him to remain silent. People who knew Ethan often misunderstood him. Some assumed he lacked confidence. Others believed he was shy. But those explanations never quite fit. Ethan wasn't afraid of conversations. He enjoyed spending time with friends. He could speak in front of people when necessary. He had raised a family, worked for decades, and built relationships that lasted a lifetime. Yet social media awakened something different inside him. Psychologists who studied this behavior eventually discovered that many people like Ethan weren't avoiding attention because they lacked confidence. Their brains were doing something much more complicated. Without realizing it, they were calculating danger. Every comment carried questions. What if people misunderstand me? What if somebody thinks I'm foolish? What if my words sound awkward? What if nobody responds? To many people, these concerns might seem insignificant. But inside the minds of silent observers, these thoughts create powerful barriers. Researchers call this social evaluation anxiety. It isn't always dramatic. It doesn't necessarily mean someone fears crowds or avoids people. Instead, it quietly turns ordinary moments into emotional calculations. Every post feels permanent. Every opinion feels exposed. Every mistake feels larger than it really is. And over time, the mind begins to associate silence with safety. What fascinated psychologists most was how often these fears traced back to memories that had nothing to do with social media. For Ethan, the roots stretched all the way back to childhood. He still remembered being 10 years old when he proudly showed his father a drawing he had spent hours creating. His father barely looked at it before pointing out everything that was wrong. He wasn't trying to be cruel. He believed criticism built strength. But young Ethan didn't hear advice. He heard disappointment. Years later, another memory left its mark. In high school, he answered a question during class and made a mistake. A few students laughed. It lasted only seconds, and everyone moved on before the bell rang. But Ethan remembered the embarrassment for years. Then came adulthood. There were awkward moments at work, jokes that didn't land, conversations he replayed in his head long after everyone else had forgotten them. Each experience seemed insignificant on its own, but together they taught his mind a lesson. Speaking carried risks. Being seen invited judgment. Remaining unnoticed felt safer. Without realizing it, Ethan carried those lessons into the digital world. Michael noticed these habits long before Ethan understood them himself. One afternoon while they were having coffee, Michael laughed and said, "You know, Ethan, I've seen you start comments and erase them more times than I can count. Why do you do that?" Ethan shrugged and smiled. "I don't know. I just don't think anybody needs to hear what I have to say." Michael shook his head. "That's not true. Half the time, you've got more sense than everyone else put together." Ethan chuckled and changed the subject, but the conversation stayed with him. Later that evening, he thought about what Michael had said. Why was it easier to stay quiet? Why did sharing a simple thought feel like standing in front of strangers? Why did harmless interactions seem so risky? Researchers found that millions of Americans asked themselves the same questions. Men and women who appeared confident in everyday life often became invisible online, not because they wanted to disappear, but because their minds had learned to associate attention with discomfort. Over time, observation became easier than participation. Watching felt safe, listening felt comfortable, and silence became a habit so natural that many people stopped questioning it altogether. But something unexpected began to emerge as researchers interviewed more silent observers. Some of them had no history of criticism, no perfectionism, no fear of rejection. They weren't anxious. They weren't worried about embarrassment. In fact, many of them seemed perfectly content with their invisibility, which forced psychologists to ask another question. If fear wasn't controlling their behavior, then what was? Because as strange as it sounded, scientists were beginning to suspect that some people stayed silent for a reason that had nothing to do with insecurity at all. And what they discovered next would completely change the way experts understood people like Ethan. A few weeks after his conversation with Michael, Ethan sat alone one Sunday morning with a cup of coffee beside him and his phone resting on the arm of his recliner. His daughter had recently sent him pictures from a family barbecue. There were pictures of his grandchildren laughing in a backyard, one of Michael holding a plate piled high with ribs, and another that captured everyone smiling together under the evening lights. Looking at those photos brought a warmth to Ethan's heart. They reminded him how quickly time had passed. For a moment, he thought about sharing one of them. Nothing complicated, just a simple picture with a caption saying how thankful he was for family. He selected his favorite image and began writing. But before he could hit post, his mind started asking questions. What if people think I'm bragging? What if I chose the wrong picture? What if somebody notices I've put on weight? What if my caption sounds foolish? What if somebody disagrees with something completely unrelated and starts an argument? Within seconds, a moment that had begun with gratitude transformed into doubt. He deleted everything and placed the phone back on the table. And once again, nobody knew it had happened. What Ethan didn't understand was that his mind had quietly created an audience that didn't exist. Psychologists have spent decades studying a phenomenon called the spotlight effect. It describes the tendency to believe that other people are paying far more attention to us than they actually are. In reality, most people are too busy worrying about their own appearance, their own problems, and their own insecurities to spend much time analyzing someone else's Facebook post. But silent observers often experience something different. They carry the feeling that everyone notices everything. A typo becomes a disaster. A blurry photograph becomes embarrassing. A harmless opinion feels dangerous. One awkward sentence feels capable of damaging relationships that took years to build. And because those imagined consequences feel real, the emotional weight becomes just as powerful as if the criticism actually existed. Researchers found that many people who rarely participate online aren't reacting to real audiences. They are responding to invisible ones. Their minds are preparing for judgment that may never come. Michael saw this happen firsthand. One afternoon, while helping Ethan clean out the garage, he found an old box filled with family photographs. Some were over 30 years old. There were pictures from camping trips, birthday parties, and holidays that neither man had thought about in years. Michael picked up one photograph and smiled. "You should share this one," he said. "Remember that fishing trip? We nearly froze to death out there." Ethan laughed and agreed it had been one of the best weekends they ever had. But then he immediately dismissed the idea. "Nobody would care about old pictures like that," he replied. Michael stared at him for a moment. "Ethan, you know what's funny? Most people would probably smile if they saw this. Nobody's sitting around waiting to criticize a fishing picture." Ethan laughed, but deep down, he wasn't convinced. Because inside his mind, the audience had already gathered. He imagined people thinking he looked older. He imagined somebody wondering why he waited so long to post it. He imagined people scrolling past without caring. And somehow, those imaginary reactions carried enough weight to stop him before he even started. Researchers discovered something fascinating when studying these patterns. The fear wasn't always connected to actual experiences. Sometimes it came from assumptions people never questioned. Silent observers often overestimated how much others cared about their choices. They imagined judgment where none existed. They replayed conversations others had long forgotten. They remembered mistakes that nobody else could recall. In a strange way, they became prisoners of their own self-awareness. Yet the irony was impossible to ignore. Everyone else was doing exactly the same thing. While Ethan worried about what others thought of him, those same people were worrying about themselves. One neighbor worried about looking older. Another worried about retirement. Someone else worried about health problems or family struggles. Very few people were paying attention to Ethan at all, but his mind continued carrying the burden of invisible judgment. And although researchers understood this pattern, they soon uncovered something even more surprising. Because for millions of people, the problem wasn't fear of criticism. It wasn't anxiety. It wasn't imagined audiences. The real obstacle came from something that appeared harmless on the surface, but quietly trapped countless people every single day. Ethan didn't realize it yet, but another force had been controlling him for years. It wasn't fear. It was standards so impossibly high that nothing ever seemed good enough. Pictures weren't perfect enough. Captions weren't clever enough. Memories weren't meaningful enough. And without realizing it, he had become trapped by an expectation nobody had placed on him except himself. Psychologists would eventually give this behavior a name. But before Ethan understood it, he would spend years believing he was simply waiting for the right moment, the right picture, the right words, the perfect opportunity, never realizing that perfection itself had become the very thing keeping him silent. And this next reason traps millions without them even realizing it. By the time Ethan reached his 60s, he had accumulated something most people would never suspect. Hidden inside his phone and stored away on old hard drives were thousands of photographs. Entire chapters of his life sat quietly in digital folders that almost nobody had ever seen. Pictures from fishing trips with Michael. Family reunions that stretched across 3 generations. Vacations taken years ago when the kids were still young. Thanksgiving dinners. Christmas mornings. Old photographs of his parents before they passed away. Pictures of his grandchildren blowing out birthday candles and laughing in the backyard. Memories that meant everything to him. Memories that deserved to be remembered. Yet somehow, they remained locked away, known only to Ethan and the people who lived those moments with him. If anyone had asked, they would have assumed Ethan simply didn't take pictures. But the truth was the exact opposite. He documented life constantly. He just never shared it. And the strange part was that he always believed he would. Someday, when he found the right photo, the right caption, the right moment. But somehow, that moment never arrived. Michael discovered this by accident one afternoon while helping Ethan organize old files on his computer. They had spent hours sorting through photographs when Michael stopped and stared at the screen in disbelief. "Good grief, Ethan," he laughed. "You could fill 10 photo albums with this stuff. Why haven't I seen half of these?" Ethan smiled and shrugged. "I don't know. I guess I never got around to it." Michael wasn't convinced. "Come on. These are great pictures. Look at this one. Remember that trip to Montana? You caught the biggest trout I've ever seen. And look at these pictures from your granddaughter's birthday. Why keep all this hidden?" Ethan looked at the screen and smiled softly. I always figured I'd share them someday. I just wanted to find better ones. Michael shook his head and laughed. Better than this? You've been saying someday for 20 years. The comment was meant as a joke, but it stayed with Ethan long after Michael had gone home. Because the truth was difficult to explain. Every time he thought about sharing something, another voice inside him whispered that it wasn't quite good enough. Maybe the lighting wasn't right. Maybe the caption sounded awkward. Maybe there was a better picture somewhere. Maybe you should wait. Researchers eventually recognized this pattern in millions of people. Psychologists call it maladaptive perfectionism. It happens when the desire to do something perfectly becomes so overwhelming that people stop doing it altogether. They postpone. They second-guess. They overthink. They wait for circumstances that never arrive. What fascinated scientists was that perfectionists often appeared relaxed on the surface. Friends assumed they were simply private people or too busy to post. But inside, countless decisions were taking place. Every photo was compared against impossible standards. Every sentence was rewritten. Every memory was measured against expectations nobody else could see. And over time, inaction became easier than imperfection. Many silent observers weren't avoiding social media because they lacked confidence. They simply couldn't accept anything less than what they imagined in their minds. And since perfection is impossible, silence became the default. One evening, Ethan sat alone looking through photographs from an old family reunion. He paused at a picture of his mother sitting beside his father under a shade tree. Both of them were gone now. He smiled as memories flooded back. The laughter, the smell of barbecue, the stories his father used to tell. For a moment, Ethan thought about posting the picture. Maybe someone else in the family would enjoy seeing it. He even typed a caption, "Miss these days more than words can say." Then he stopped. He looked at the picture again and thought perhaps another photo might be better. Maybe he should crop it differently. Maybe he should wait until the anniversary of his father's passing. Maybe he should write something more meaningful. And just like that, he closed the phone. Another memory disappeared back into silence. It wasn't fear that stopped him. Nobody had criticized him. Nobody had rejected him. Nobody was watching. Yet perfection had convinced him to postpone something beautiful. But as researchers continued studying people like Ethan, another discovery caught them completely off guard. Some silent observers didn't struggle with fear. They weren't perfectionists. They weren't trapped by anxiety. In fact, many of them had no desire to share in the first place. They weren't waiting for the perfect picture because they had already made peace with keeping their lives private. They genuinely enjoyed watching others celebrate. They loved seeing family updates and pictures of old friends. But they felt no need to stand in the spotlight themselves. And this changed everything psychologists thought they knew. Because perhaps silence wasn't always a symptom. Perhaps it wasn't something to fix. Perhaps millions of people weren't avoiding attention because something was wrong. Maybe they simply preferred another way of living. A quieter way. A calmer way. And for people like Ethan, that realization would eventually become one of the most freeing discoveries of his entire life. As the years passed, Ethan slowly began to understand something he couldn't have appreciated when he was younger. There had been a time when recognition mattered, a time when approval felt important, a time when he worried about keeping up with everyone around him. But somewhere between raising children, losing loved ones, working long hours, and experiencing the victories and disappointments that come with life, his priorities changed. He no longer felt the same need to explain himself. He no longer felt responsible for proving that he was happy. One quiet evening, Michael stopped by after church, and the two old friends sat on the porch watching the sun disappear behind the trees. They spoke about family, retirement, and how quickly life seemed to move. At one point, Michael laughed and held up his phone. "Look at this," he said. "Some people spend more time taking pictures of their dinner than eating it." Ethan smiled. Then, after a moment of silence, he quietly replied, "Maybe some things are better enjoyed than advertised." Michael chuckled, but he never forgot the sentence, because it carried a truth many people spend their entire lives trying to understand. Years earlier, Ethan believed happiness had to be shared. He thought every achievement deserved applause and every memory deserved witnesses. But age had taught him something different. Some of his greatest moments had never appeared online. The day his daughter graduated college. The afternoon, he held his first grandchild. The camping trip where Michael nearly fell into the lake and laughed so hard he couldn't stand up. The quiet evenings with his parents before they passed away. The conversations with old friends that stretched late into the night. None of those memories needed likes or comments to matter. Their value came from living them, not displaying them. And somewhere along the way, Ethan discovered that privacy wasn't loneliness. Privacy was freedom. He no longer worried about proving that he was successful. He didn't need strangers to celebrate his happiness. Peace itself had become enough. And strangely, the less attention he sought, the lighter life felt. Problems seemed smaller. Comparisons disappeared. Expectations lost their power. What once felt important now seemed strangely exhausting. Researchers studying personality began noticing similar patterns among countless men and women over the age of 45. Many had learned lessons that younger generations were still chasing. They had discovered that not every opinion required approval. Not every blessing needed an audience. Not every memory required validation. These people weren't withdrawing from society. They weren't bitter or disconnected. They simply became selective. They invested their energy carefully. They preferred meaningful conversations over endless arguments. They chose genuine friendships over public attention. And for many introverted personalities, observation itself became a source of peace. Scientists found that introverts often restored their emotional energy differently from extroverts. While some people gained excitement through constant interaction and visibility, others found renewal through reflection, listening, and quiet moments. People like Ethan weren't antisocial. They simply experienced fulfillment in different ways. Watching others celebrate didn't make them jealous. In fact, they often found joy in seeing people they cared about succeed. They didn't need to stand in the center of every room. They were content sitting quietly, enjoying life without announcing every detail. Michael began noticing this change more clearly with each passing year. One afternoon, they attended a family gathering where everyone seemed busy taking pictures and recording videos. Children ran through the yard. Grandparents laughed under the shade trees. Conversations filled the air. Yet many people seemed distracted, focused on capturing the perfect image instead of enjoying the moment itself. Michael looked over and saw Ethan sitting quietly with his grandson, teaching him how to bait a fishing hook. Neither of them touched a phone. Neither of them seemed concerned with documenting the memory. They were simply living it. On the drive home, Michael smiled and said, "You know something, Ethan? Half the people there were trying to prove they were having fun. You were actually having fun." Ethan laughed softly. "Maybe that's because I've learned something," he replied. "The best moments don't always need an audience." And perhaps that was the difference. For years, people assumed silence meant emptiness. But often, silence was peace. And peace had become more valuable than attention. Yet just when psychologists thought they understood the mystery, researchers uncovered something nobody expected. It challenged assumptions that had existed for decades. Because while some people protected their peace by choice, scientists discovered that another group wasn't simply making lifestyle decisions. Something much deeper was happening. Something hidden inside the brain itself. Advanced studies began revealing that certain individuals experienced rewards differently. Their minds responded to observation in ways that surprised even experts. And what researchers found next would completely transform the way people understood silent observers like Ethan. Because the final reason had nothing to do with fear, insecurity, or even privacy. And the truth shocked even researchers. For years, psychologists believed they had already solved the mystery. Fear explained some people. Perfectionism explained others. Personality traits answered a few more questions. But as neuroscience advanced and researchers began studying how the brain responds to social rewards, something unexpected emerged. It wasn't simply that some people preferred privacy. It wasn't just that they worried less about attention. Their brains appeared to process satisfaction differently. Scientists discovered that for certain individuals, the reward centers inside the brain became more active during observation, learning, in reflection than during self-promotion or public recognition. In simple terms, some people experienced genuine pleasure from understanding rather than broadcasting. They enjoyed absorbing information more than sharing it. They felt fulfilled by listening rather than speaking. And suddenly, people like Ethan no longer looked strange. They looked different, not broken, not disconnected, different. For decades, society had assumed that everyone secretly wanted attention. But the evidence suggested otherwise. For millions of people, attention simply wasn't the reward everyone assumed it was. Without realizing it, Ethan had been living this truth his entire life. He loved listening to stories. He enjoyed watching documentaries. He remembered details other people forgot. He noticed changes in people long before anyone else mentioned them. Michael often joked that Ethan knew everything that happened in town before the newspaper did. He remembered birthdays without reminders. He noticed when someone seemed troubled, even if they tried to hide it. He could sit quietly in a room and somehow understand what everyone else was feeling without anyone saying a word. And strangely enough, he had never thought much about it. To him, it was normal. But to those around him, Ethan had always possessed a calm wisdom that made people feel understood. When neighbors faced difficult times, they called him. When Michael struggled after losing his brother, Ethan sat beside him for hours without trying to fix anything. He simply listened. Years later, Michael would admit that those quiet conversations helped him more than anything else. And perhaps that was because Ethan had never felt the need to dominate conversations or become the center of attention. He found purpose in understanding people rather than performing for them. Researchers began noticing similar patterns among thousands of silent observers. Many displayed high levels of empathy and emotional awareness. They often valued depth over popularity and meaningful relationships over large social circles. While others chased approval, they quietly invested in experiences and connections that truly mattered. Brain imaging studies suggested that some people received stronger feelings of satisfaction from curiosity, reflection, and learning. They didn't require applause to feel complete. They didn't need strangers validating their choices. They weren't interested in becoming celebrities in their own communities. In many ways, they lived according to values that society had almost forgotten. They enjoyed conversations without needing to win them. They appreciated beauty without needing to photograph every second. They celebrated success without announcing it to the world. And perhaps most fascinating of all, many of them appeared perfectly content. While others exhausted themselves chasing attention, these quiet observers found peace in simply living. One afternoon, Michael and Ethan sat beside the lake where they had spent countless summers fishing together. Neither man said much. They didn't need to. After decades of friendship, silence no longer felt awkward. As the sun reflected across the water, Michael suddenly laughed. You know, Ethan, people think you're quiet because you don't notice things. But I think you're quiet because you notice too much. Ethan smiled and looked out at the lake. Maybe, he answered. Or maybe I've just learned that not everything needs to be said. Michael shook his head and smiled. You always know when something's bothering people. You remember things nobody else remembers. And somehow, you've always understood people better than most. Ethan laughed softly. That's because I've spent my whole life listening. The word stayed with Michael long after that day. Because perhaps the world had misunderstood silence all along. Maybe being quiet wasn't the absence of something. Maybe it was the presence of something deeper. Remember those invisible people we talked about at the beginning? The ones who watched everything but rarely revealed themselves? The people everyone assumed were lonely, shy, or disconnected. Perhaps they were never invisible at all. Perhaps they simply refused to compete in a race they never wanted to run. Perhaps they understood something that others spent their entire lives searching for. Because underneath that silence may be decades of experience, years of reflection, quiet wisdom, deep compassion, emotional intelligence, the ability to observe without judgment and appreciate without comparison. And ironically, the quietest person in the room often notices what everyone else misses. While the world sees silence, something far more valuable may be taking place beneath the surface. Maybe people like Ethan didn't withdraw from life. Maybe they simply chose peace over performance. And perhaps that choice was never a weakness. Perhaps it was one of the greatest strengths a person could possess. As the years passed, Michael found himself thinking more and more about something Ethan had once said while they sat together on the porch. Maybe happiness doesn't need witnesses. At the time, it sounded like a simple observation. But the older Michael became, the more those words stayed with him. Because everywhere he looked, people seemed exhausted. They were chasing attention, comparing themselves to strangers, arguing with people they would never meet, and measuring the value of their lives through numbers on a screen. Everyone seemed to be fighting to be seen, fighting to be heard, fighting to prove something. Yet the man who had never joined that race appeared strangely content. Ethan wasn't wealthy. He wasn't famous. He didn't have thousands of followers. But he slept peacefully. He enjoyed his family. He valued his friendships. He appreciated ordinary moments. And perhaps that was what so many people overlooked. In a world obsessed with being noticed, maybe the rarest thing of all was choosing not to compete. Maybe true peace had nothing to do with applause. For decades, society had quietly taught people that visibility meant significance, that being known meant being important, that the louder voices somehow mattered more. But Ethan's life told a different story. Some of his happiest moments had never been shared. The long conversations with Michael, teaching his grandson how to fish, watching old Western movies with his father before illness took him away, holding his granddaughter for the first time, laughing with family during holidays that existed only in memory now. None of those moments required comments or approval. Their value came from experiencing them. And perhaps that was something many people have forgotten. Maybe meaning and attention were never the same thing. Maybe a beautiful memory didn't become more beautiful because strangers saw it. Maybe joy became stronger when it was lived rather than displayed. And perhaps that's why Ethan never seemed bothered by what he wasn't receiving from the world. He had already discovered something that couldn't be measured by followers, likes, or popularity. One evening, Michael asked Ethan a question that had been on his mind for years. "Do you ever regret staying so quiet?" Ethan thought for a moment before smiling. "Not really," he answered. "I've watched a lot of people spend their whole lives trying to be noticed. Some found attention and still weren't happy. Some got everything they wanted and still felt empty. I guess I just stopped believing that being seen was the same thing as being fulfilled." Michael sat quietly, thinking about those words. Because maybe silence wasn't loneliness. Maybe silence wasn't weakness. Maybe silence wasn't something broken that needed fixing. Maybe silence was freedom. Freedom from comparison. Freedom from expectations. Freedom from chasing approval from people whose opinions didn't really matter. And maybe the people society often misunderstands are carrying lessons that everyone else has forgotten. Remember those invisible people we talked about at the beginning? The ones who see everything but reveal almost nothing? The ones many assume are lonely, shy, or disconnected. Perhaps we've misunderstood them completely. Perhaps some of the most interesting minds are the ones we hear from the least. Perhaps the quiet people notice things everyone else misses. Perhaps years of listening have taught them wisdom that noise often drowns out. And maybe the greatest question isn't why they choose silence. Maybe the question is whether they've discovered something the rest of us have forgotten. Have we confused attention with meaning? Have we mistaken visibility for happiness? And are the quiet people among us seeing truths that the world, in all its noise, no longer notices? Years later, Michael would still smile whenever he thought about his friend. Not because Ethan had become famous. Not because he had finally started posting every detail of his life. But because, after all those years, Michael realized something that had been sitting right in front of him the entire time. Ethan had never been hiding from the world. He had simply chosen to experience it differently. While others spent their days chasing attention, Ethan spent his building memories. While people argued over opinions, he listened. While others worried about being noticed, he quietly invested in family, friendship, and moments that no camera could fully capture. And perhaps that was why, despite everything life had thrown at him, he always seemed to possess something many people spent decades searching for. Peace. Real peace. The kind that doesn't depend on strangers. The kind that doesn't disappear when applause stops. The kind that comes from knowing who you are, even when nobody is watching. So the next time you come across someone who never posts, never comments, and never seems interested in stepping into the spotlight, don't assume they have nothing to say. Don't assume they're lonely. Don't assume they're disconnected. Because some people don't need the world to know they're happy. They don't need followers to prove they're loved. They don't need applause to feel successful. They don't need validation to enjoy life. They simply live. They enjoy conversations without recording them. They treasure memories without broadcasting them. They celebrate blessings without announcing them. And maybe, just maybe, that's the secret so many people are searching for. A life that doesn't require constant approval. A life where peace matters more than attention. A life where being present means more than being noticed. Perhaps that's why Ethan never felt like he was missing anything. While everyone else assumed he was absent, he had been paying attention all along. He knew who needed encouragement. He remembered birthdays. He celebrated victories quietly. He noticed pain hidden behind smiles. He listened more than he spoke. And in a world growing louder every year, maybe that quiet awareness became one of his greatest strengths. Because understanding people was never about who talked the most. It was about who listened the deepest. And maybe the people who seem invisible are often carrying wisdom that noise can never teach. So now we'd love to hear from you. Are you someone who enjoys sharing every chapter of life with the world? Or are you one of the silent observers, quietly watching, listening, and appreciating life without feeling the need to announce every moment? Let us know in the comments below because your story might help someone else understand themselves a little better. And if this video changed the way you think about quiet people, share it with someone who rarely posts but somehow always seems to know everything. They might see themselves in Ethan's story, because understanding others changes the way we understand ourselves. Sometimes what we mistake for weakness is actually wisdom. Sometimes what we call silence is simply peace. And sometimes the people who speak the least are the ones who understand life the most. And if you thought this story was fascinating, wait until you discover what psychologists say about people who suddenly disappear from everyone without explanation. Because what researchers uncover about those individuals may completely change the way you think about human behavior forever. Until then, remember this. Not everyone who stays quiet is lost. Some people have simply found something the rest of the world is still searching for.